Okay, now how do we look at the IBC? There are actually only two methods. Okay, the first method is actually look at the subcluster 4-chamber view and tilt it downwards. After you have identified the IBC, rotate about 90 degrees to get the long axis. Okay, and this is actually my preferred method because you will always be able to see the IBC from here. Or another way, we'll just do a short axis of both the IBC and the iota, decide which one is which and rotate about. Right? So there are two methods of looking for the IBC itself. Now, after you have rotated 90 degrees, you get the long axis of the IBC. You look for the middle sympathetic vein because that will suggest to you that you are looking at the middle of the IBC, right? And typically you look at the margin that is just about 1 centimeter distal away from the insertion of the middle sympathetic vein. Okay, so this is what we're going to do. We're going to see how IBC helps us with shock assessment, preload assessment, whether or not this patient is going to be fluid responsive, and last but not least, whether or not this patient can tolerate our fluid load. So let's talk about shock first. We suggest to you IBC is very, very important when we do shock assessment, especially when we're looking at hypovolemic and obstructive shock. Okay, if I give you a patient's heart at the shock axis level, where the heart is small both systole and diastole and squeezing very well, which class of shock do you think this patient is in? Obstructive, hypovolemic, cardiogenic, or distributed? Very small heart, not feeling well, squeezing very hard. Very good. You will suggest a hypovolemic heart, right? So if you see something that's small, it suggests that this patient has a hypovolemia. Now, how about this heart? Is this heart small? It looks pretty small, right? Okay. Is this heart squeezing quite well? Yeah, it's moving quite rapidly, right? So does this patient has hypovolemic shock? But if you look at other segments of this patient's heart, you see that this patient's heart in the apical 4 actually was very, very big on the right side. The right side is totally way off the roof. Right? So what does this patient have? This patient actually has acute pulmonary embolism leading to obstructive shock. And you can see that this patient's LV, when we do the shock axis just now, is equally small when another patient was hypovolemic. Okay, now take a look at this one. If I were to try to see the shock axis view of this patient's heart, I will hardly be able to make out any LV at all, right? So the important thing is this. If you have a small heart squeezing well, quickly take a look at the patient's IBC. If the patient's IBC is flat, this patient is hypovolemic. But if the patient is obstructed, you will expect the IBC to be swollen out like a big balloon, right? Because venous return cannot happen, and therefore your IBC is going to be big. Now, this kind of classification is not that useful for a patient with cardiogenic shock or a patient with distributive shock. Okay? So we use it mainly to distinguish between a hypovolemic as well as an obstructive shock. Now, this kind of assessment, very easy looking, is not going to be useful for patients with pre-existing heart diseases, patients with left bundle branch block, patients with valvular pathology. And what do you think is the last frontier that you cannot apply this on? You will be patients with more than one class of shock. Hypovolemic plus distributive, hypovolemic plus obstructive, for example. Okay? Now, let's talk about preload. When we talk about preload, we are asking ourselves whether the patient's volume is too much, too little, or just nice. Let me show you one case of spontaneously breathing patient. I saw this patient, he was 75 years old. Well, he's supposed to go for dialysis, but because he has diarrhea, he missed his dialysis. He comes in with blood pressure about 70 something, low blood pressure. So because he missed his dialysis, it can be overloaded. Because he has diarrhea, he can become underloaded. So you take a look at this IBC, what do you think? It's very, very small, right? It's like pencil thin. So we know that this patient is definitely hypovolemic. And we give some fluid. But before we do that, we actually take a look at the heart. This patient has a very well squeezing heart. Okay? So it suggests that this patient's hypotension is not going to be cardiogenic. So after giving some fluids, you can make up a slight trace of IBC. And after giving 1.5 liters, the IBC actually dilates to this sign. If you tell the renal physician, oh, I'll give this patient 1.5 liters of fluid because, well, he happened to miss his dialysis, but there's a little bit of diarrhea. They will look at you with eyes wide open. Case number 2. This patient IBC like that. Does he need more fluid? No. Probably not, because when you look at the heart is not squeezing well. If you give the patient more fluid, the fluid will end up in the lung, right? And the patient will become breathless, on top of being hypotensive. Case number 3. Does this patient need more fluid? Should we diurese the patient? So this patient turned out to have this thing called a tamponade because the IVC is flat. Alright? So we can see very clearly in a spontaneously breathing patient, we use IVC as a surrogate for right atrial pressure. Not that much for pre-load. Okay? This paper actually came out in 2010. There are very nice guidelines as to what the approximate CVP is when you have IVC diameter and IVC. So in summary, IVC corresponds to preload if it's very small. It corresponds to an overload if it's very big. But remember, a big IVC can also mean any of these things, especially obstructive shock. So IVC unloaded, IVC overloaded, less than 1 centimeter, more than 2 centimeter, anything that's in between is a little bit of a question mark. Right? So what do? We have to move on to the next topic called fluid responsiveness to see whether or not our patients that lies between this spectrum, right, is going to respond to our fluid challenge. So this is what fluid responsiveness is about. So everybody knows that this is called the Frank-Starling curve. The question everybody asks is, where is my patient on this Frank-Starling curve? This is fluid responsive. If I give fluids, I will increase the cardiac output. This is totally flat. If I give fluids, we will end with pulmonary edema. Right? So what determines where your patient is on this Frank-Starling curve? Is it the systolic function of the heart? It's actually not systolic function of the heart because if you have a patient with cardiogenic shock, this is the Frank-Starling curve for your patient. If you have a patient with obstructive shock, the whole curve moves to the right. Now, of course, if you have a distributive shock, the curve is going to look very, very steep. Okay? So the systolic function doesn't determine where our patient is on the Frank-Starling curve. And the venous return is actually the one that determines where your patient is on. Now, where the venous return meets your Frank-Starling curve, this is called the operating point of your cardiovascular system. Now, Frank and Starling, or rather Starling and Frank, developed this curve. And the same Starling, which is another Starling, developed the venous return curve with a guy called William Davis. Okay? And in fact, both of them agree so well with each other that they literally become brothers-in-law. Now, just to illustrate, that venous return actually determines your cardiac output. If you have a very, very strong bow, will you be able to shoot very far? You will be, right? If you have a very, very weak arrow, you won't be able to shoot very far. But exactly how far your arrow shoots really depends on how hard you pull. The harder you pull, the further it goes. The weaker you pull, the lesser you will actually fly off, right? So the venous return actually determines our cardiac output. Now, what does this got to do with what we're talking about? The first thing I want to share with you is this thing called obstructive shock. So this is normal Frank-Starling curve. This is normal person's venous return. Imagine this patient suddenly develops a tension pneumothorax. Okay? This curve will look like this, shifted to the right. Now, is this patient fluid responsive? He's going to be super fluid responsive, right? Because he's going to hit at the most deepest part of your Frank-Starling curve. But let me tell you, anybody with obstructive shock, this term called fluid responsiveness is actually a very, very big misnomer. Okay? Because no matter how much fluid you're going to give, because of the obstruction, it's not going to reach your LV. It's not going to increase your cardiac output. So what they need is actually not more fluids. They actually need a relief from the obstruction. Either you put in a needle or you lyse the clot. And it's especially important in a patient with obstructive shock to recognize this physiology when you do something heroic. What do you think that is? That's when we try to increase the patient's intrathoracic pressure even higher by doing intubation. Alright? So if the patient has obstructive shock and we do not recognize it, we start to intubate because of the low BP, trust me, your patient is going to really crash on you. So it's very important to make sure this thing doesn't happen. So the rest of the discussion here got nothing to do with obstructive shock. We're talking about fluid responsiveness in terms of hypovolemia and cardiogenic shock distribution. Okay? So we have already mentioned there's some static measurements. So this is an absolute, so anything less than 1 centimeter, you can probably give the patient fluid. But there are also dynamic measurements. And the purpose of dynamic measurement is actually to see how well, when the myocardium is actually stretched, whether or not your cardiac output can increase. So the most practical way of doing that is actually by giving fluid challenge. That's what we do all the time. We give more fluid and see whether the cardiac output increases. But sooner or later the patient is going to end up with pulmonary edema. So we don't want that to happen before our patient starts atrial fluid. So one of the easiest ways, one of the ways that we do it is to examine the left heart by this thing called the passive leg raise. We raise up the leg, we drain the 300, 400 ml of blood that's sitting around in the leg, going nothing into the heart, thereby stretching the heart and see whether the cardiac output increase. This is not what we're going to do in this course. We're going to take a look at the IVC. So we're trying to see whether or not the IVC size changes with intrathoracic pressure changes. Imagine the patient is full tank and you have a change in intrathoracic pressure. Will your IVC change in size? It won't change in size very much, right? If the patient's tank is actually not so full, if you have a change in the IVC, change in the intrathoracic pressure, then your IVC size will start to vary, right? So we're using the filling of the right heart via the IVC as a surrogate for our dynamic measurement. So if the patient is mechanically intubated and you give a positive pressure breath, the IVC will dilate. Okay? In a patient with spontaneous breathing, at the start of inspiration, when the patient starts to take an inspiratory breath, the IVC will collapse. Okay? So in other words, we are looking at two similar indices. One is called the collapsibility index, one is called the distensibility index. It's always D max minus D minimum divided by D max over here for collapsibility, D minimum for distensibility. Can everybody remember this? One is minimum, one is maximum. I must confess I cannot, so I try to simplify it. So I say that this is the change, whatever the size is, the biggest and the smallest. And for this one, I look at the diameter of the IVC at the start of inspiration. Okay? So at the start of inspiration, for a patient who is mechanically intubated, we're going to have a minimum diameter because inflation, or rather inspiration, is going to distend IVC. Right? Similarly, or rather on the other side for collapsibility, we're going to look at the start, which is at the maximum, because when the patient takes his breath, his IVC is going to collapse. So let's take a look at the mechanically intubated patient first. The distensibility index, if it's more than 18%, which means the IVC distends by more than 80%. Dr. Barber in the studies have shown that they are likely to be fluid responsive. Anybody who distends less than 80% is unlikely to be. And this is the RC curve. You can see that using this distensibility index, cutoff of 18%, well, the thing is 0.91, which is pretty good. And comparing that to CVP, which is only 0.57, which is as good as tossing a coin. So we can actually use this for our patient who is mechanically intubated. What do you think is the caveat? The important thing is to make sure that your patient is passively intubated. In other words, your patient cannot be taking a spontaneous breath, because they can appreciate that any spontaneous breath that's generated is going to vary your intrathoracic pressure. Okay? And the second thing is that this study is done pretty long ago. The tidal volume they use is a little bit on the higher side, so you must make sure that your tidal volume is about 7 to 10 mL per kg. Okay, how about spontaneously breathing patients? Do you recognize this patient? Maybe some of you do. He has gone overseas to give ultrasound talk and come back, develop a massive diarrhea. Since he's always talking about IVC and responsiveness, the whole department is waiting outside to see whether he's responsive to IV fluids or not. And eventually he needs about 5 liters of normal saline to resuscitate him. Okay, Dr. Muller actually did a study, and he has two groups of patients. One, he finds that those respond to fluid, one that doesn't respond to fluid. And if you draw the line at the 40% mark, in other words, your IVC collapsed by more than 40%, most of the people in this group are actually the responders. Right? But if the IVC only collapsed by less than 40%, you will find a group of responders versus non-responders. Right? So what do we do with this group of patients? How do we know whether this patient is going to be okay with this additional fluid that we give? And that's why we have come to this concept called fluid tolerance. Now, all the while we're talking about responsiveness, whether your cardiac output increases, but actually, we are also very worried about whether the patient is going to pulmonary edema. Right? So, if the patient is not going to pulmonary edema, whatever fluid that you give, the patient will be able to tolerate it, and therefore it can actually keep going. So, if this patient is on this steep part of the curve, and this is what the lungs look like, would you be able to give patient fluid? Yes, because there's no V lines. If there's no V lines, there's no pulmonary edema. So this patient is hypotensive with a dry lung, I will give fluid. After giving more fluid, the lung still looks like that. I can give more fluids if the patient is still hypotensive. When I reach something like this, the deflecting point, I will start to see a couple of V lines. Then that's when I'll worry that I'm going to give the patient pulmonary edema if I'm going to give more fluid. At this point in time, you have to consider giving something else, such as a vasopressor. And the beauty about this thing is, this V line is going to happen even before your patient becomes symptomatic. In other words, you will know that this patient, who is looking breathly well, not breathless now, is already reaching this deflection point. Okay? So of course, if you continue to persist giving fluid, you will end up with a massive pulmonary edema at some. In other words, if you have a patient with hypotension and no V lines, this patient is considered fluid tolerant, and you will be able to give this patient fluid to improve the patient's blood pressure. If the patient has V line, it's on here, fluid should be given cautiously if at all. Right? So what do you think is the pitfall of using this concept of fluid tolerance? It will be only for patients without V lines to start with. Okay? If your patient is hypotensive and already has V lines, you won't be able to decide whether or not your patient is fluid tolerant. Or really, if your patient has fluid at the beginning, what do? Well, we can always go back to normal sound. We can use our clinical judgment, or we can learn more about hemodynamics, especially echo dynamics, to help us to resuscitate our patient even better using ultrasound. So let me try to summarize what I've said in a few slides. If you see a patient with hypotensive, eyeball the IVC and the squeeze of the heart, the first thing you want to look for is an obstructive physiology. And once recognizing an obstructive physiology, go immediately to diagnose the pathology, whether it's a tension pneumothorax, pericardial tamponade, or what's the third one? Pulmonary embolism, okay? So quickly look for an obstructive physiology, diagnose the pathology, and intervene, all right? Relieve the patient of the obstruction. Now for the rest of the patient who doesn't have obstructive shock, well, we'll talk about this curve, the Frank-Starling curve. And you can use static measurements if they are very small, such as IVC being less than 1 centimeter. For patients who is intubated, we can use a cutoff of 18 centimeter. For patients who is ventilated, we can use a collapsibility index of 40%. And for those who is not collapsing by more than 40%, we use the concept of fluid tolerance. Okay? Alright, so this is my take-home message. If you want to examine a patient's hemodynamic profile, remember, don't just look at the heart, but always look at the heart, the lung, and the IVC in totality. Okay, thank you for your attention.